This conference will now be recorded.
All right. For the purpose of this recording, my name is Rod Soto. I'm here with Chris. We both belong to HackMiami, and today we're going to talk about um, dangers of unregulated supply chain. This is something that we decided to research on due to recent events, mainly the SolarWinds campaign, which, in my opinion, was a devastating attack that compromised around 18,000 customers from that company. It's unknown the amount of collateral damage, the amount of information that was exfiltrated, and the future consequences of what happened after this campaign. I am going to say it. I am not an expert on this. This is something that we do at HackMiami. We try to teach ourselves new things and research on new topics. And this is how we learn. And as bumpy or as trial by error that it can be, it's the way we advance, and it's the way we look at new things. And obviously, our interest peaked after this whole SolarWinds campaigns. And I'm going to let Chris introduce himself.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris, but I'm known as Blue Flots of HackMiami, and basically it was Rod here first introduced me to like the rest of the HackMiami when I just decided to go down and see HackMiami for myself for the first time for like I think it was what year was that, Rod? Like back in 2019?
I think it was 3, 4 years ago, right?
Yeah, yeah. I just was down there at the beach and I was like, hey, I heard about HackMiami here to 10. They got the cool badge, and I was like. But it's a Friday, so I knew that was training for Rod. So I was like, all right, so what do I do? I was like, well, why don't you go upstairs? There's a guy named Rod Soto up there. He's teaching the class. I was like, okay. So, and
Right.
that's where we met. And so basically, currently what I do right now is I'm an incident responder with Alchemy Technologies. I've been there for almost 2 years. And then previously, I've got experience with the Army and security communications, and then DoD contractor. Um, but I think what's relevant though in this particular talk though with me is I worked with a small company and they actually utilize SolarWinds. So I know this firsthand because actually one of my jobs in that time frame while I was working with this company is that basically I handled SolarWinds and I was interacting with one of the said customers that Rob was talking about. But when I go in to talk to it, you realize that it was more than just like customers, like customers of customers, and it's just a domino effect. So um, it's a little doozy. So back to you, Rod.
Awesome. So I'm hoping that you can provide today some of your personal experience. I used SolarWinds in the past. Never been in a position to be on MSSP level, but I know them. They actually have good products. Actually, to be honest, they have some applications that are very useful and that I used before in my life of system administrator. Actually, so let's go ahead and let me share this. Again, I want to make sure that all of you understand that we're not experts at this. This is a way for us to get started on this subject because when I started looking at this, there was really not much of, um, particularly in things that you can sort of a apply or even with colleagues. So it looks like many times this is sort of specific to certain scenarios and size of companies. I after I learned that this can actually affect small companies as well. So I was not really an expert on this, and I try to basically do this research in order to bring myself up onto what things we as defenders need to look at when we are in approaching the risks of supply chain management. So let me, I'm going to start with, can you see this right, Chris? Is it okay? Is it, okay, good. So you already heard from us. I co-founded HackMiami, Pacific Hackers. Chris is a member of HackMiami. He's an incident responder and a security researcher as well. He started with us 2 or 3 years ago. And Chris is another example in a success story of what you can be. He came from the armed forces. I was trying to break into cybersecurity and kept coming to our meetings, kept participating in CTFs, learning himself about many things that we discussed in our meetings and documents and information we share, and eventually we were able to help him transition into InfoSec, and now he's full-time. So here, what is supply chain management? So I took a generic definition of supply chain management. This one specifically says that supply chain management is the process and activity of sourcing the raw materials or components an enterprise needs to create a product or service and deliver that product or service to customers. By the nature of this definition, basically it looks to me like in a sort of an ecosystem where a company grabs stuff from other parties, essentially third parties, in order to put it together and eventually deliver it to a customer. And we will see that in the next slides, how this actually represents an entire attack surface that can be affected, that can be tampered with, and that can affect the bottom line, which is your perimeter or even your product. So here's some of the attacks that I was able to research on supply chain management. Basically, I took this from MITRE, which is the government entity that basically produces a nomenclature of most of what we actually consume in InfoSec, like Microattacks or CVEs or KPEC. So basically, there are 4 types of attacks that involve supply chain management: malicious insertion of hardware, malicious insertion of software, malicious insertion of firmware, and malicious insertion of a system information / data. So we're gonna take a look at all of this during this presentation, but you already can probably tell how this type of attacks are, and we're gonna look at them in a little more detail. So here's before we get into the specifics of the attacks, an historical perspective of the supply chain management campaigns, and we have one that just happened. We had one in 2015 that involved Juniper Networks, where basically there was some sort of a exploitation via the use of bypass authentication, and code was changed. You also have another campaign in 2015 called Xcode Ghosts, which targeted iOS developers by sending them a fake Xcode version. If you're aware, Xcode is usually a framework that Apple developers use. In 2017, we had the NotPetya, basically targeted a accounting software provider, which in that case was MeDoc, And actually, I did a little bit of research on this campaign, and this campaign was pretty interesting because my suspicious as of today is that during NotPetya, there were several payloads. Some of them look like actual ransomware, but the ones that were directed to the actual target, which was many of the government organizations, including utilities in the targeted country, were destructive. And one of the things that I think they did is actually they released one of these looks like standard ransomware samples to the community. So then it was sort of this was an amazing campaign, by the way. And again, these are my suspicions. I don't have, obviously, I don't have proof to say this is exactly what happened, but I was actually monitoring as it was happening. And I do remember that all of a sudden there were some security companies saying, hey, we got a sample in NotPetya, and it's simply a standard ransomware. As this was happening, the target was actually receiving the actual destructed NotPetya, which was, I think it has some sort of a wiper payload. So this was very interesting because the way they did it, it was pretty clever. It was a way of basically distracting the public opinion, misdirecting even the perception, saying, "Ah, this is just standard ransomware," but in reality, the targeted victims, which were delivered this payload because they were using a third party software called MeDoc, which is the accounting software, their payload was destructive. We also have another example in 2017, Fluxiv. Fluxiv actually target the crab cleaner tool. I'm sure many of you are familiar with crab cleaner. I use crab cleaner all the time during my life of system administrator. In fact, I will always download crab cleaner because crab cleaner will clean your registry, will clean all the crap that you have, like temporary files, things that other programs left in the system. If you use them, but you don't use them anymore, or uninstall them, and the uninstallers, usually uninstallers are very, some uninstallers are very messy and they leave a lot of stuff inside the systems. So, dude, the way to go is crab cleaner. But guess what? They went and this actor went and targeted the crab cleaner tool, knowing that many people downloads it and use it, including, I actually read some of the Russian APTs were actually using crab cleaner themselves to clean after themselves. Well, guess what? If they had downloaded it during that time, they would have been compromised themselves, or it would have given away the actual host that they were compromising. And of course, now we have the 220 SolarWinds, right? 18,000 customers affected, including many government agencies. It is my opinion that this was a catastrophic, disastrous campaign. And I'm going to let Chris in a minute give his point of view because we, in my opinion, I'm going to say this is a personal opinion, we were lucky. And we were lucky because this seems to be mostly espionage. But if this would have been an actor that wanted to basically be absolutely malicious and destructive, this would have been catastrophic, not only for all of us, for our country in general. I've seen the result and the effects of campaigns like the ones against Saudi Aramco, where they wiped 30,000 servers. I've seen what can happen. In terms of real life, we just saw a little example of it with Colonial Pipeline. These type of attacks are in nature destructive. They really can cause real life effects. And we're lucky that in the case of SolarWinds, there was no destructive payload that we know of as of now deployed, and it looks like it was mostly espionage. That's my knowledge until now. Maybe we will find out later on that there is other types of payloads that may have been left in. I don't doubt that could be the case, but I'm going to say it again. We were very lucky because if these individuals, instead of doing espionage, would have been driven by destroying the systems, all of us, we would have been in huge trouble. And then before I let Chris talk a little bit about it, we just had another campaign, which is also of supply chain nature, which is this Novellian group, which apparently is from Russian origin, or is said to be of Russian origin, which basically compromised Constant Contact. And Constant Contact is a provider of email communications, email marketing, and then by compromising a one account, I believe was USA, they started to fish or target State Department individuals, basically trying to find out information about related of the soon-to-be happening meeting between President Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin. So this is another example of the importance and the effects of supply chain management campaigns. So, Chris, you wanna give us a little bit of your take on the SolarWinds?
Yeah, I sure can. Let's see. Can you go to the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, before I joined Akamai, I was working for a vendor down in remotely, though I could say, but this vendor was primarily located in Fort Lauderdale, and my job there at the time was basically just like basic IT support. That's all it was really, and then the occasional looking at being a system admin, making sure computers were patched and such. Now, what that I never handled, and before this, I never handled SolarWinds before. Never touched it. Didn't really see much of it when I was in the Army or in the DoD contracting. But when I started to interact with it more and more, I was like, okay, yeah, this is kind of like a real hyped up version of, at least in my view, it's like a hyped up version of remote desktop. So in the case, it's like, you have the vendor handling this client, which this client, by the way, was located mainly in Palm Beach. However, they had an office also an office in Fort Lauderdale. Now, once I get more and more into it, I realized that this was more sensitive and more like, revealing on to the client itself. And we were helping with this client with basically is in IT support, right? So like in this case, like in this slide right here, it's like with the CSA issuing the bulletin on SolarWinds, but beforehand, before this bulletin, there really was not much issue, and it was like what Rod said, it was widely distributed among agencies and other private sectors too. And it was a means of like, okay, it's simple, it's pretty well built together, and let me see if I can share this, or at least put it in the chat. They also had a disability here too. I'm gonna put it in the chat to enable 2FA, two-factor authentication. So the way it works is in this remoting in, I'm here in, say, near Tampa, and the client's in like Fort Lauderdale, and then like we were chatting in real time. And I could actually call them too, but the chat was actually faster. And then they had the issue like, hey, I'm having problems. Okay, and then I remote in. Now with SolarWinds, this was more about the control of it was more on my end, less on the client, because what it took is basically once you had your workstation set up, then you just had to like install maybe 2 or 3 programs really on their end. And then basically what it is, it didn't really exactly leave it open to remoting in, but it was fairly easy, to be honest. Just to be able to remote in. And then when I say remote in, if their computer was unlocked, um, it didn't really like give the prompts like, oh, hey, by the way, such and such here. I actually had to let them know ahead of time that, this is me, I'm on SolarWinds, and I'm coming in to look into their computer. And they had the capability, this is like red tape, but basically at the time when I was working with this vendor, interacting with this client, they did not, I'll say this again, they did not have two-factor authentication enabled. But if it was enabled, what it is that when I remote in, the client has to give me the code in order to let me complete the login. Otherwise, it would just stop it right then and there. But again, at the time when I was doing this, my job, it was not enabled. Can it be enabled? Yes, it can be. You're just reading the documentation on it. So can you go to the next slide? Okay. Let me see. Can you make that bigger? I know it's a little hard to see, but it'll explain. I'll go into more into details about it. All right. So this was basically my main screen right here when I was basically an admin for this. So what you see here on the left, on the left side of it, it's like you have all these other like users in itself, like even workstations identified that have been either currently active or not active using the SolarWinds remote monitoring. And then in the top center is when you actually are interfacing with the workstations and servers, I might add, of the client. So say this client had a terminal that was having issues. Well, I would still to be able to remote in just as easily, just basically by right clicking and just enable remote desktop. That's basically all it was. And it went straight to it as long as the computer was on. But there was a caveat to that with this software that you're seeing in front of you, you can enable like remote code execution on this. Not just like, just like remoting in like a remote desktop, but like you can actually do a lot of stuff, a lot of opportunities, a lot of vectors you can do with this. And then what you see right there too also is like the status of that said workstation, or even like if you look on the tasks too, like it shows you like servers, workstations. So again, I can interact with the server too. And I could put, and then like what Rob was saying, like you can enable like malicious software on there. Like I can install a keylogger on there if I want to and get the credentials. Because even though it was the SolarWinds, they still use Microsoft 365, but that they then still go get the credentials for it just by using this remote code execution. But what I found was immediately disturbing, what this client had was they were, I'm not trying to reveal too much detail about it, they were into travel. So they handled like domestic, international travel, and we're talking about passports, we're talking about health forms, vaccinations, financial statements, accounts. I mean, when I was able to log in, I had true visibility of it. So even me working, legit, like being able to log into this, if an actor, a bad actor was able to get access to it, in which they did, they they immediately could have had access to all this. So it's like in the triangle hierarchy, it's reversed, so that once you get access to that client, that customer, then you just immediately get access to their clients' workstations and computers, and then beyond that, their financial statements, their PHI, the PII, and then even then in the software too, you can right click and you can see like what status of their, like if they were due for updates. You can roll back an update too. So it really was a lot of control, and it was a lot of easy manipulation, to the point like what Rod's saying, like you can inject malicious software in here. You can easily mail something to them and say, hey, this is part of your computer, just look it up, hook it up to the computer, done. They could easily put like a hardware version of a beacon on there and just go in anytime. So
Right. The specific also the what made the SolarWinds even more difficult to detect, based on the information I have, is that they first compromised SolarWinds itself, and then they were able to basically either steal the certificate or add malicious code to the updates. And this is in response to a question in the chat that says, even if you're able to validate the certificate with the backdoor or whatever malicious payload work, the answer is yes. And this is exactly what happened here. If I am able to compromise SolarWinds, for example, and already have access to their updates, and I am myself as a malicious actor embedding code, they're not checking the code, but they're signing it and then delivering to their customers, the answer is yes. You won't be able to even detect this, because if you actually look at the signature will be valid. And I actually saw some of the stuff that Microsoft did, very interesting, by the way. They were comparing lines of code, and that's how they were able to discover it, where it's incredibly hard and difficult. That's why supply chain management attacks are very difficult to defend against, because we will see soon you depend on things that you can control. And very good that Chris was able to tell you firsthand how powerful specifically this tool was. And this is not just one, there's many other. We had seen campaigns that involve other software like TeamViewer, for example. And there are many others. It doesn't just need to be.
yes.
The thing about SolarWinds is SolarWinds was good reputation, and it had an incredible amount of government clients. I myself would have used it. I was actually surprised when I heard that they were compromising, because I had used SolarWinds in the past, not just the agent, but other tools that they have that are actually pretty good. So this is actually very telling. The adversaries are now looking at sources that we trust, because obviously other ways are harder to go through. And we will see that in as we move on this. Something else you want to say about this before we move on, or are we ready to move on this?
Yeah, it just basically like if you still utilize this, um, even what after what's happened, I would highly recommend that you push this enable two-factor authentication, because at the very least, if they still get malicious code and injected in back into it and then try to push it, that's one thing. But if you still put this 2FA inside SolarWinds enabled, it at least gives the client some type of a barrier or defense that prevents them from getting inside the actual workstations or servers.
Good point. So actually, you know what? You can actually go on this one. This one is actually, if you want to go on this one.
Yeah, so basically, like, okay, so I believe it was FireEye. Am I correct, Rod, about when they first detected the issue?
Yeah.
Yeah, so they were like they must have they saw something initially and it didn't quite right. So they looked into like what Rob was talking about, like the code, and like, wait, that's not right. It's a legit cert, but it's somehow it's malicious. But then all of a sudden it was like I don't know, for lack of a better term, it's like a wildfire in California. It just spread, and they realized like, oh wow, they got into like the the um, the update server of it for SolarWinds. It's like, oh man, and it went everywhere. So it's it, it's amazing like how if you get to the source of it and then you just are able to do that interaction with it and then be able to get inside of it and then be able to just go anywhere. And then like the timeline here is like, but it goes back like uh, September of 2019. It's like, okay, we know something was going on, but then, and then of course too, a little bit later, they start doing the test code, the test, and then with the ejection, and then they were like, okay, so far so good, nothing really, like stands out, nothing's getting red flags. So it's like, okay, the next step. So we start deploying it. So it's kind of in the cyber kill chain. It's like, okay, reconnaissance looks good, weaponize it, deploy it, and just start pivoting on it. And then it's like you right here, like you see like in 2020 or February 2020 is like a sunburst, which is the actual vulnerability with the Orion and SolarWinds. So it it's it was kind of eventually hard to detect because again, it's like you're using a trusted software. It's like trusted like Microsoft Word or in Office. Like, okay, so why you shouldn't have a problem with it? So that's the problem with this. It was so in deep of it, and then like how like they try to do the hot fixes on it. Um, they try to remove the malware, and then back to like what's it, December 2020, and I think that's about right. That's when
Yeah,
like they started noticing about it.
yeah, again, what you just said actually is pretty telling. How you react to this? I mean, you had to invalidate the cert. That's probably the first thing you need to do, and then you have to uninstall whatever you had installed. But the problem is how far in depth they went, uh, and that is very telling when you look at the sequence of events, because it's malicious insertion, like what we look at first. They did malicious insertion of software in a trusted entity. The trusted entity was SolarWinds. So we will look at it in a minute, as far as how can we defend how these attacks are actually. There's an entire catalog, by the way, of how these attacks are divided. So let me actually move this forward. And this is something that you can actually help me as well. We would like to let you know as well that there are certain contextual items that not necessarily um, formally of a supply chain, but that will affect you and that will affect your attack surface. Some of those things are commercial off-the-shelf hardware and software. Like for example, yeah, you have all your stuff tied together, but you decide to buy, for example, a router that has a backdoor, right? That you went and bought in Best Buy, and this router has a backdoor because it's manufactured in an adversarial country, and now you are compromised. So that's a simple example. I'm not sure if you remember one time there was a lot of rumor. There was a rumor about a certain server manufacturer which supposedly had been implanted this malicious insertion of hardware, right? It was implanted with some chip that was calling back another country, or you can actually modify the firmware. That's malicious insertion of firmware. For example, you find out that one of your adversaries is buying a type of server or a type of device. The device is intersected and then the component, malicious component, is inserted. That's a way to perform a supply chain attack. Also, you have to take a look at things such as open source components. Open source components can be targeted, and that's been seen in recent history. How if you, like for example, PHP was targeted for backdoors, for example. So that's a way of basically you attack the component is being used as the victim, and now victim updates or downloads that component, and you're able to get to the victim. There are other stuff that you also need to take a look at, like rogue insiders, foreign components, and we will see that at the end, how to address them. Third-party applications, which may or may not be of your formal supply chain, and temporary personnel subcontractors.
Rod, can I say something about that third-party application?
Yeah.
So with the vendor I was working with and handling the customer, and like what we did, we set up basically a business Office 360 with this customer, and that was another domino of that getting SolarWinds breached, so that when you interacted with the said client, like workstations, you also had visibility of their Office account too, which unfortunately, again, red tape with the client, they did not have two-factor authenticated enabled for their Microsoft either. And we were like, I told my boss, I was like, we got to do this. It's more time played, luck played with like not getting breached. So, and it's just, again, I had to emphasize the 2FA when something comes in like this, especially when a major application like SolarWinds is branching off and affecting third-party applications like Microsoft Office 360.
Good point. So let's talk a little bit of the challenges based on what we've seen. The challenges on securing the supply chain, right? Basically, how, for example, and a lot of this is it's sort of a mix-up with IT operations, to be honest. Most of the time, SecOps may have to do with security updates, but not with really regular software updates, for example. So I personally have worked in very large environments as a system engineer, and change and configuration management was fundamental. This is something that can truly prevent certain types. Let me just say it again: certain types of supply chain attacks. Why? Because the fact that you have a strict configuration history and restrictions and changes that can happen from one day to the other may indeed many times save you from downloading malicious updates, or if something has changed, there are so many checks in place that it will be caught. And I was a witness of this many times, where I actually had to do major upgrades as we went through the configuration and change management process. There was a lot of checks, and the type of patch we were going to do, was this tested in development? There's a number of things that can definitely help prevent this type of attacks, certain types of them. Software integrity, obviously. This is something that you, like somebody brought up in the chat. You wanna check the integrity of the software. You wanna make sure that this should be very basic. Basically, checking the checksums. If it is MD5 or if it is SHA-256, whatever it applies to it, that should be a common procedure. Although this will not have prevented the attacks. For example, the SolarWinds, because the signature came from the actual provider, the developer. But in some cases, like for example, let's say for example you download a certain or a certain provider gets attacked and is pushed, a certain version of the software is pushed, if the attacker is not able to compromise the entire chain of the provider, you might be able to catch it by checking integrity. Also, you want to pay attention to inventory of assets and components within the chain. Basically, you want to know and make sure that you are aware of every single thing that is involved in your supply chain, like Chris says, including third-party applications and or origin of components, origin of applications and components, and then you had to keep track and inventory. Without asset inventory, which is something that is very basic and sometimes it's forgotten in many of IT and security circles, and that's your starting point. You have to know, what is it that I have here, hardware-wise, software-wise. Also, things such as the software development cycle security. And this takes us back to, are there open source components that are exposed? Are there libraries that are vulnerable? Are there untrusted developer sources that we need to take a look at? And reiterating this, third-party personnel and vendors, obviously, you have to, there has to be a management and control, because obviously this may or may affect you in the sense of this type of attacks. So let's see, you have something, any comments on this, Chris, or we're good?
I'm good.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the MITRE supply chain attack framework. I was actually, like I said before, this was a driver for me to research about the open and available sources of information in regards to supply chain attacks. And I was able to find this. There's a nice white paper. I will share it actually in the Discord later on, where they actually were able to create a catalog of supply chain attacks, and they were able to identify 41 types of these attacks, created 20 countermeasures, which we're going to see at the end of this presentation. And they were basically able to create definitions of the different components that are included in the supply chain management attack surface. And I wanted to show you this. So what you see here is, this can be a little convoluted. We're not going to get into the specific of this, but what you see in this graph is basically how MITRE was able to basically break the different components that that are involved in a supply chain attack, and the possible insertion points, the possible places, right? For example, you can see things such as substitution, alteration, malware, things that can be considered malicious insertion. You can also see how the things that are directed or components that can be directed at, like system software development locations, internal environments, parties that are involved in the supply chain, such as subcontractors, prime contractors, or even hardware and software components. Here's another example of the supply chain points of attacks. And this is something that we're not really going to delve specifically attack by attack, because we'll be here forever. But it's important for you to be aware of this, and you can actually research this. You can read on this, and apply this to your environment and see, try to address if you are exposed and how to mitigate. Not sure if Chris, you have any comments on this, or we're good to go.
Yeah, it's just like what you were saying, Rob, about like the type of attack with the firmware and how basically you just go insert it into there and see how like you follow like basically with the P8, it just traverses throughout, and then it's like trying to stop like a runaway train at this point now.
That's actually a good example. That's a great example. Well, maybe you can help me in this one, Chris. Here's the attack identifier 821, and I took this from the catalog to bring up an example. Right, in this case, it's a software update that contains malicious code. Is applied to the system being sustained. So the attack vector, for example, is an adversary that can leverage, or has leverage against an automated process, whereas it's going to be, this update is going to be downloaded and installed. And by doing so, then obviously you're able to compromise whoever is installing this update. So here in the breakdown, it tells you like several of I guess items that are related to this type of attack. Like I said, we're not going to basically get into every single one of them, but if you're a person that you work in manufacturing, you work in critical infrastructure or software development, I highly suggest you that you read this framework, take a look at the components, and have a conversation with procurement, have a conversation with SecOps, have a conversation with IT, where you can identify your potential points of exposure based on this framework, which I think is very useful. And here's something that we already touched on, and I think Chris is, you couldn't get a better example than Chris. Chris knows the story firsthand. There's a reason why MSPs are targeted. They're targeted. The MSPs, obviously, they fulfill an important function. Many companies, they don't want to have a full-time IT person. Many companies can't afford it, right? MSPs have a function. You know, you have people that are trained, that knows the products, and that takes care of your environment. So what happens if I attack the MSSP and I can compromise the MSSP? Now I have entries in their customers. And here's what some of the things that Chris says in regards of, for example, things such as 2FA. When somebody's accessing your systems remotely, can potentially help discover or even isolate or contain a supply chain sort of attack. Not sure if you have any other comments on MSSPs or things that you want to tell us.
With me handling the SolarWinds, I know that you do have audit logs being enabled. At least for us, being as the vendor, we did have audit logs. We had the ability to, at the very least, see activity about we as the vendor interacting with said client at certain time on certain workstations. So yeah, I would just say like you check your logs daily, especially with SolarWinds or just like any MSSP like this. But yeah, just make sure you have audit logs enabled.
Awesome. So since we already touched on this, I also wanted to let you know that there are some micro-attack techniques, which basically are under T1195. Nowadays, this is sort of the language we all speak. I myself, every time I had to produce a report or communicate with an external party or colleague, I had to use this. So that way it's clear of what I'm referring, like in terms of tools, techniques, and or tools, tactics, and procedures. So within the realm of supply chain attacks, there are some supply chain compromise TTPs, which are under T1195, which include compromises software dependencies and development tools, compromises software supply chain, compromises hardware supply chain. So that's something that is already included in the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So here's some of the things that sort of we already touched on, but it is important to look at them because I guess, and this is something that happened to me as I was doing this research, I realized that there were many things that I took for granted, things that I buy, things that you procure, things that you install, things that are in your systems that you had no idea where they're coming from. And that's why we did a contextual slide, because you may have all this configuration management, all these strict procedures, but then you go to Best Buy and you buy this cheap Chinese router and then you're compromised. So these are things that you gotta be careful. You definitely have to be careful. You have to be on the lookout. And here's some of the points where the supply chain can be compromised, so which we already touched on, such as development tools, development environment, source code repositories, even if they're public or private, open source dependencies, distribution mechanisms, systems that are infected, replacement or legitimate software with modified versions. That's actually one of the most difficult, in my opinion, to actually detect. Modify counterfeit products to legitimate distributors, and shipment interdiction that can happen too, which I sort of describe it like, for example, you realize that a victim is procuring a number of devices, they're intersected at one point, and hardware or even firmware or even software components are maliciously inserted, and then they go and get installed at the victim. Okay, so we had heard some of the great recommendations from Chris for detection. He suggested to basically check your logs. I think the visibility, right? Visibility, meaning if you're not already reviewing, analyzing the logs for the potential sources involved in this type of attack, then you have to start from there. And in this case, what we want to do, besides the visibility, we had to have verification of the binaries, right? Which can be done through hash checking. I think I already mentioned this. There is you can always do software checksum they are published. Even Kali, for example, has its own hashes that you can check when you download it. There is a mechanism, and if your vendor doesn't give you that, they must give you that. Like if they're going to send you a patch, or they're going to send you a new version of a software, there should be, for starters, a way to check the integrity, and the integrity is usually checked by, running sort of a hashing mechanism that produces exactly the same hash that whatever is downloaded. That is one way to do it. However, if the vendor is compromised, this won't do much. But this is one way of checking for possible compromise. Also, you can scan downloads for malicious signatures, and like I said before, change configuration management, testing software and updates in developer environments, taking the time to actually perform this radical updates or upgrades at times may save you from just arbitrarily installing something that is malicious by nature because your vendor was compromised. They also suggest, this is also from MITRE, perform physical inspection of hardware to look for potential tampering. There's an actual a contest in DEF CON called Tamper Evident that has to do with this type of checks. Just saying. So let's move on. Here's some of the suggested mitigations. Obviously, we had to look at verification. We had to look at patch management. When this patch management process is implemented, obviously, you have to go for the basics. Where's this coming from? Is this verified? Has this been tested? Who sent us this? Does the signature check with what the vendor sends us? The problem many times, guys, and I know this coming from the IT world, is that there's no such thing. You know, we patch emergencies. You know, we're told we had to push the service back. We're told there's this new threat and we had to update and apply a patch, and that's perfectly fine at times. But if you are a company that is aware of risks and is highly targeted, you know, these things had to be done through a process. These things had to be done carefully, and there's many things that you had to check, including vulnerable dependencies, unnecessary features, components, files, things that may simply allow the adversary to get a hold on your surface. And one of them is obviously paying attention to the software update management, or even updating the software when it's found to be vulnerable. Also, they recommend vulnerability scanning, which is continuously monitoring vulnerability sources. Some of these attacks, you basically, I would say it's too expensive to detect. Like, for example, what Microsoft did with the patch, the malicious patch, where they had to go code by code. I don't think that's practical. So basically, the more efficient way to do this is to do it at the basics of, once again, what is it that I have in my systems? Where is it coming from? What are the possible insertion points? What is it that worries me? Do I have an architecture that will prevent an adversary, even if they're able to get in, to go further? So there are many considerations that you can do as basic prevention measures to protect yourself against this type of attacks. And here's the countermeasures that they actually propose in their white paper, which we already talked about it, but I'm just gonna show them here and comment on some of them. One of them is actually supply chain red teaming. In order for you to do this, you had to visualize and outline your supply chain and then have somebody test it. Have somebody think like an adversary and attack it. And that should give you an idea of where your insertion points might be present. Things such as tracking tags and security tags, simple things, right? Again, it comes down to what is it that I have, when did I install it, what version I have, was this tested, sort of a thorough revision of the basics of asset management and inventory, and I think that will get you started pretty quick. There are other things that are interesting, like, for example, verifying your vendors, buying a bulk of spares, so you don't have to buy from sources that may use or target you via their vendors, and use of multiple suppliers. This is a little bit more like advanced, like electromagnetic thermal analysis. Not sure if you did some of it, Chris. You totally look like you did some of this, but
Yeah,
yeah.
I did. while I was working at Raytheon, one of the quality assurance checks I had to do was for doing an EM and thermal analysis to make sure that it met the standards and quality before we released it to the customer.
Excellent. So uh, these are, again, some of the countermeasures that MITRE proposes against these attacks. Again, I will be sharing the URI on the white paper so you can actually research further. And with that, I think that's it, unless you have something else that you want to talk about, Chris.
Yeah, so back to what you're talking about the hash, about when receiving the patch or software. Given right now what has been going on lately, I think like we need to do like in part like a physical hash. Like we need to verify, not just digitally, but like physically. Like okay, we know the vendor gave a good product. They have it established with us, but don't trust it completely. So do like what we do at HackMiami. Like we have something the rule needs to implement. We need to stage it. So like what you're talking about, the red team it, put it in a sandbox network in environment. Make it look like it was like the real thing for the customer. So start looking for the vector, start looking for entry points, look and see what it's doing. Like run Wireshark on it, look at the packet, see what it's trying to talk to. And another thing too, also is that when it comes to like patches and other future softwares coming out, it's always good to like investigate it. Don't. I mean, you can sell a great demo, but again, just listen to your team because like and like it's a team effort because like you have the devs like developing the code. We got to have the security engineers and the architects look into it. And it's like, no, it looks good, but let's like, trust but verify, basically.
Exactly.
Just
Exactly.
like,
And
so
one of
that, I mean, that's,
actually, I wanted to ask you about this, Chris. That since we had this campaign, which was the SolarWinds one, and then now we recently had the Colonial, which is not supply chain, but the government, and that's what my question is. The executive order has pushed zero trust as a one of the I guess a defense against many types of attacks, including supply chain.
yeah. So I know this is kind of like rambling, but like it's like how many times does the client, the customer, does us as the citizen of this country have to go through the continuous attacks from private sector or public sector? It's just like they need to really understand and emphasize, and we emphasize like this is serious. We could be actually still under attack. It's just not
Yeah,
like
yeah.
not the conventional kinetic based like wars, the desert wars, the guerrilla wars, but this is cyber war. This is cyber warfare, and we could be still be going under attack even right now, especially with SolarWinds. That opened not only a can of worms, that opened a carton of can of worms. So now they were able to go everywhere. And then if you were running like a patch or a packet analysis, and then see like how SolarWinds could be connected to say like the Colonial or what else like the NTA or like some of these other attacks. It's just like you start connecting dots to the point like, okay, when is it enough? When is this? And I think really the Colonial pipeline really hit like that was it because in the U.S. government's mind, the Colonial pipeline even though the reason why the company said they shut it down because of billing. They can't just like give free fuel for it.
Right, right,
But it is a national security because that affects everybody. That affects the military. That affects commercial. That it hits everywhere, and especially too. Look at the diagram of the pipeline where it starts and where it ends. It basically took from the southeast to like near the north, near Pennsylvania. I'm like,
right.
I mean, that to me, that is a de facto state of war. That was an act of war right there because
Right.
you literally hit everybody, and that was including civilians. So
Well, actually, Kevin Tucker just wrote that, which is something that I just read. Apparently, the FBI is considering ransomware actors now as terrorists. And I think you're right. I think we have passed the point of annoyance or nuisance or, oh, it's just espionage, to wait a minute, it's the gas, it's the subway, it's the meat. What else is next? Or it could have been the government, if you think about it. If they have gone disruptive of SolarWinds, I mean,
yeah,
disruptive, who knows how many services from the actual government. So I agree with
I
you.
I think like with the SolarWinds though, I think we still have not seen the end of this yet. I don't think we're still assessing it, and right now I think what we're seeing is just like the ripple effects that then gaining access to compromise credentials, logins, or even in this case, like networks or equipment that is not even patched, and they're just sitting it. And we need to emphasize that equipment itself that we get, regardless of the sector or vendor you work for, this equipment will not update itself. You still have to physically or like put in the code and say, yes, update. If it affects your revenue or your operation of business, well, put this into perspective. Look how long the Colonial Pipeline was down because of this ransomware, or the food packing, or the MTA. I mean, and other previous attacks. Look how long they were down for. And we're not talking about like hours. We're talking about days, sometimes weeks. Versus, okay, we can run this patch. We need to run this critical update to these systems. Okay, let's do it when it's that peak hour. Let's do it 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, where it's like just little traffic, minimize the impact. And I'm telling you, if we can emphasize that to all these other, and even then, with the ransomware, it's like with the Colonial Pipeline, they paid the ransom, they got the decrypting software, but then they realized like, wait, it's not efficient. So another thing to consider too
It's gonna take
is
a while.
a
Did everything, right?
a disaster recovery plan. Literally, like in like one of your slides, like you have a it's kind of like in a sense almost like in being a prepper. You buy all this water, you buy all this food, just have it in place just in case something happens. And I think that's what needs to happen also with these vendors. Is that if you can't do anything else, get it back up as soon as possible. That way you have these supplies right here, have this equipment ready to go, and like in the event of ransomware attack, and they should not be paying it first off, and they should not. It encourages the actors to do it again to others.
Right. Right. It
So
reinforces their
yeah,
behavior.
I know. And like, look, it's just a hard drive. This is like a 6 terabyte hard drive. Look how much information this thing can hold.
Right.
And just buy it and then hold on to it. And if you need to do like updates on it, fine. But have it readily available in the event like you basically get attacked. And like, okay, don't pay the ransom. Just immediately start getting your systems back up.
Oh, that's definitely an option. Some of them have chosen to pay for some reason. I mean, we don't know the specific of this, right? We don't know if they really got them good, which is what this is what I think. I think they got them so good that they had no other choice but to pay. And the criminals know that. That's why they do their job first. They take the exfil, right? Ransom, move around, and make sure that they got all the backups and everything they need to get. So that way they leave you one alternative, and that is pay. So I know we're diverting a little bit from the supply chain, although it does have a little bit to do with it. But at the end of the day, overall, I think it was SolarWinds what really started, in my opinion, opening my eyes of how bad things are, and I can see it has gotten worse right after that, which is now we have all this ransomware campaigns, but it tells us how vulnerable and how unprepared, that's my opinion, not only government, but private sector. So when obviously it's private government, and when the ransomware, it looks like it's mostly the latest campaigns are vertical, critical infrastructure type of companies.
Yeah, yeah, and it's just
See, somebody has a question. Any opinions, questions? Since,
yeah. I say yeah. The ICS, IoT. I mean, look what happened in Osmar. Be able to go in and start adjusting the chemical levels, and only because a guy was actually at the right place at the right time in front of the screen, noticing that his mouse was moving while he moving it. If he wasn't there, that water supply would have been like damaged. Like we would be having a similar case with like Flint, Michigan. We can't trust the drink water. You can't trust the tap water. You got to start buying bottled water.
you were actually close to that, right?
Yeah, I'm like maybe one county over, and I know like because of COVID, like everybody's been gone having to do remote, and that's really put a strain on working like remotely and having to adjust from working from said office to your home. Yeah, again, it's just like your security plan, your security initiatives have to adjust to whatever operation you're conducting, whether it's in person, hybrid, or totally remote. You've got it. And I know the internet was originally designed to be connectivity, to be open, but you also have to make it secure too. So you got to have that balance.
Any other questions? I'm going to stop the recording now.